Robert, welcome.
Spencer, pleasure to be here.
Why do you think debate is so important?
Well, I think it embodies a lot of the Stoic values that I talk about in the book. It's the idea of open-mindedness. It's the idea of critical thinking. It's the idea of certain amount of humility about one's own views. It's a way of bringing into the public square what I call a contempt-free zone, where people can appreciate the nuances of complex issues. They can hear the other side with respect. They can privilege facts over emotions. They can privilege logic over ideology. So it seems to me to be a very important way of bringing something to the public square that's sorely missing right now.
Do you think there's been a decline in debate?
Well, there's certainly been a decline in the level of public discourse. I think our political culture has gone in the wrong direction in a world in which almost everything else has gone in the right direction.
It's fascinating to read essays by politicians and think, wow, I could never imagine the politicians of today writing these.
No, it's true. One of the books that I cite in Stoic Capitalist is Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, in which he documents the huge amount of progress that's been made in so many areas of human life. And then he sets up political culture as the one counterexample, which he describes as an irrationality magnet. And in the book, I talk about some of the reasons I think our political culture has gotten so toxic and dysfunctional, which we can go into if you like.
Yeah, what are some of those reasons?
Ironically, a lot of them were well intended. So when I was a young man, political candidates were selected in, quote, smoke-filled rooms. And those were rooms that had professional politicians picking candidates that they knew personally, who were by and large reasonably well qualified for the offices that they were going to hold. And the process was not democratic. It was not transparent. And that got substituted with direct primaries. But what happened was the combination of direct primaries and gerrymandering meant that 90% of all congressional seats are safe for one party or another. The only election that matters is the primary, and the only people who show up at the primaries are the most liberal Democrats and the most conservative Republicans. So it's kind of pulled the culture, the political culture to the extremes and left the center kind of politically homeless. That's just one example. Another example might be campaign finance reform. Again, it sounds benign, but if you're going to raise $100 million to run for the Senate in a decent sized state, and you've got to do it in $2,900 increments, the only way to get people to write checks is to fuel their anger. Uh, you get them afraid they're going to lose their gun rights or afraid they're going to lose their abortion rights. They'll write a check. If you campaign on the basis of you believe in sensible compromise as a way of getting things done, nobody writes a check for that. Another one is what's gone on in network television. So when I was a kid, there were only three networks. You would think 30 or 40 is a better situation. But when there were only three, their motivation, if you owned one of them, was to build as wide a tent as possible, alienate as few people as possible. Today, the motivation is create a tight emotional bond with a narrow group of listeners or viewers. Fox did that better than anybody and is the most profitable network as a result. So those are just some examples of things that sound on the face of them pretty good, but at the end wound up hurting our political culture. Another one, very important, is social media. When people get their news largely through social media, they're basically living in a filter bubble where the algorithms that direct things to you that are only reinforcing your current set of beliefs. They're not challenging your belief system. They're not making you confront any inconvenient facts.
On the example of campaign finance reform, it feels like there are significant drawbacks in either direction. Because as you point out, if you do lots of small dollar donations, then maybe that creates weird incentives to push to get people afraid and to make them hate the other side. But on the other hand, if you accept really large checks, then you could say, well, it's not a very democratic process. It represents what wealthy people want rather than what people in general want. So how do you think about that balance?
There are definitely advantages to campaign finance reform, although I would say that corporate money in politics has tended to be very bipartisan. Union money, on the other hand, has all gone to the Democrats. So I think it's just simply a more nuanced question and a worthy subject for open to debate.
Yeah, so let's talk about open to debate. Can you tell us what it is and why you created it?
Well, open to debate has become the kind of gold standard of debate in this country. And I created it because I was involved in a number of center-right think tanks, and I felt that they were doing good work, but basically preaching to the choir. And I just felt that our political discourse in America had gotten kind of angry, kind of dysfunctional. People weren't listening to each other. And I thought debate was a way of bringing something to the public square, as I started by saying, that would encourage people to engage with the other side, to listen to a different point of view than their own, maybe to be persuaded, but maybe just to emerge with greater respect. And that seemed like a very worthwhile thing to do. I also had from a child, or at least an early adult, in reading biographies and developing my own ideas about what was a well-lived life, the idea of philanthropy, not so much as giving back, but as using the talents you have to create the institutions that you feel society needs. And this one seemed manageable to me. It was something I could afford to do. I thought it needed doing. And so I ran with that ball 20 years ago. And, we were really right on so many things. 20 years ago, our very first debate was we can tolerate a nuclear Iran, relevant today. 20 years ago, we said Russia is becoming our enemy again, relevant today. We did Hamas. An elected Hamas is still a democratically elected Hamas is still a terrorist organization. So that was 20 years ago. So we were really ahead of the news cycle in terms of anticipating what are important issues, what are the issues worth debating.
And the format is that you have one person on each side usually, and then the audience votes based on what side they start on, and then at the end you see which side they change to. Is that right?
That's certainly one of the formats we use. That sometimes two debaters versus two, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes a little more formal, Oxford Union style, sometimes a little less. Mm-hmm. But basically, the common element is that both sides are presented. And that voting, particularly in the live events, was great because it gave people in the audience a sense of really participating. And it gave the panelists a sense of really, wanting to get people to change their minds. And the statistics were amazing. We had generally around 30% of people who came with an opinion would change their minds. And I would sort of walk around the audience at the end and ask people if they changed their vote. And people who didn't would frequently say, well, I voted the same way twice, but boy, there were facts that I had never considered before, or moral sentiments on the other side that I had never considered before. So I thought that was really a triumph.
That's great. I imagine there's some selection of the sort of people that come to watch debates are more open-minded and more willing to listen to evidence.
Yeah, there's definitely a self-selection process going there. Absolutely.
One thing that people sometimes say about debates is that they can fall into sort of using persuasive tactics because, right, if you're trying to convince others, then presenting a kind of fully fact-based argument may not actually be most convincing. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's generally true. I mean, if you present a lot of statistics, for example, you're not going to win a debate. If you can frame an argument in a way that is resonant emotionally with the listener, that's really much more effective. I'll give you one little anecdote. I think this was one of the most effective summations in all of the debates we've done, which is hundreds. The resolution was prohibit genetically engineered babies. And you can sort of imagine the public reaction would be in favor of that resolution. People are scared of science. They think of, Frankenstein's running around. And the woman who was arguing in favor of genetically engineering summed up her argument by saying, I care a lot about the way you people vote today because it's very personal to me. A good friend of mine had a rare form of cancer, would be unable to have normal children, and with genetic engineering, she was able to have normal babies. And then she said, I have that same form of cancer, and when it comes time in my life to have babies, I'd like to have healthy ones.
That's powerful rhetoric.
Debate over.
Do you worry that debates can become more about rhetoric? Or do you think for the most part, just through the selection of who are the debaters and so on, you're able to focus more on sort of evidence?
I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, there are debates that have been extremely angry. We did one recently on the resolution, Israel's actions in Gaza are justified. And it was, I mean, both sides were really angry and almost had to be sort of almost physically, not quite physically separated by the moderator. It was very hard to keep order. So it was not a model of reasoned discourse, but at least people got to see the passions that animated the other side. The Jerusalem Post wanted every member of the Knesset to see that debate, just to hear what the intensity of the Palestinian feelings were about their actions.
Yeah, sometimes what I say to people is that even if they think the other side is completely wrong, understanding the other side can still be helpful because it can help you figure out how to get people over to your side. It can help you figure out how the other side is convincing their side. And so I think, even if someone's not persuaded that the other side has any chance of being right, I think there's still arguments in favor of listening to debates.
Oh, absolutely.
A format that I've explored on this show sometimes is trying to do a kind of undebate where the idea is that I bring on two people who strongly disagree and they work together to try to figure out if they can agree on why they disagree. So trying to find sort of the key roots of their disagreement. I'm curious if what your thought is about that.
I kind of like that. I mean, we had actually thought about a format that sort of started out with what do you two guys agree on, and then move into the areas of disagreement. But I mean, we usually start with the disagreement and then explore the reasons and the areas of common ground. But I thought it'd be interesting to experiment doing it the other way around.
One thing I find fascinating is that a lot of disagreements, they're disagreeing simultaneously on many different axes. So for example, they might have a disagreement about facts, like what's empirically true, but simultaneously disagree about values. So even if they agree on the facts, they still wouldn't agree because one group thinks this is more important, another group thinks this other thing is more important. And they can even disagree on sort of more subtle things like what is the right way to reason from the set of facts to a conclusion, right? So there are times when scientists might be looking at the same set of facts and disagree on what to conclude from it.
Sure. No, that's absolutely right. But I think the point is that issues are contentious because they're complex, because they're nuanced. If they were simple, you wouldn't have these divisions. And people living in sort of filter bubbles can sort of think that the issues are much simpler than in fact they are. And when you get into debate, at least you understand that there are facts pointing the other way. There is moral sentiment on the other side. You might not agree with it, but at least you're aware of its existence and that the people on the other side are not just idiots, but that they have some facts, they have logic too, and that there are nuances here that if you're living in a completely filter bubble, you're not going to be aware of.
One thing I like to do every once in a while is for something in society that's believed that I really don't understand how people could believe it, I'll go watch the commentators who support that viewpoint. I mean, like, how do, for just as a silly example, like, how do people believe in flat Earth? Like, how is it, like, how in the modern world could someone believe that? But it's interesting to go watch people promoting a flat Earth and look at the way that they're talking about it. And then you can begin to see, oh, I can kind of see how if this was like most of the content people consumed on this topic, that, yeah, it could be quite persuasive because they often have things that sound very persuasive, even though there's subtle reasons why they're totally wrong.
I was exposed to an example yesterday. I went to an art exhibition uh, by an artist who's absolutely fascinated. His name is Trevor Packlin, absolutely fascinated by the secret world, the world of espionage, spies, that kind of thing. And it turns out that UFOs, which is in this kind of category of how can you believe in it, there have been actual deception operations that have created the appearance of UFOs. So there you go. And you wouldn't have thought about that, or at least I wouldn't have.
Yeah, and someone who's really savvy, who's promoting ufologist beliefs, could point to these examples and say, look how convincing this is, and there might be something to it. Interestingly, I just learned yesterday what might have been the origin of the conspiracy that President Obama was not born in the U.S. Because I always thought that was just kind of made up whole cloth, but it turns out it was due to a printing error. There was a old book that talked about him, and it misprinted him as being born in Kenya. And so suddenly it makes so much more sense that like why people believe this, because you can go actually find this book that said that.
Interesting. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, I always thought it was just sort of came out of nowhere. But then it's like, so now you have to be like, no, that was a printing error. That was a mistake. And,
well, that UFO was a misinformation operation.
Yeah, exactly. These things are often more complicated. Or, you even take something like these really wild, like QAnon beliefs and about like these pedophilia rings and all this stuff. And then you're like, well, okay, Jeffrey Epstein was a pedophile on a massive scale. You're wrong about the pedophilia rings, but there are other pedophilia rings, right? So it's like, I mean, there's a lot of nuance there of like, at first it sounds completely crazy, but then you're like, okay, you can begin to see why someone could, if they watch the right news or they watch the right YouTube commenters, begin to believe that.
Well, we usually will do debates only if we feel that there are pretty good arguments on both sides. I mean, we're not going to debate flat Earth, but
Right.
We will debate Israel and Gaza. We did a debate, actually, the one that was released just a couple of days ago was Alan Dershowitz debating on the subject of did Harvard have it coming against Larry Summers. So you had these two really Harvard stalwarts, and nobody was defending the Trump administration's actions. But the debate was really about whether Harvard made itself a target by doing things that were really inappropriate for Harvard to be doing.
Yeah, sometimes people wonder whether they should give voice to one side because they worry, like if they think one side is sort of more righteous or has more of the better arguments, they're like, well, even by giving the other side airtime, they might be doing harm. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm totally against it.
Yeah. Why is that? Is it because you just think the value of like hearing both sides is more valuable than sort of trying to choose the side that you think is more righteous?
Because if it's a complicated issue and it's a contentious issue, your side is never 100%. There's always something on the other side. There's some facts, there's some logic, there's some moral sentiments. And to deny them, to silence them, is just putting your head in the sand. It's not constructive.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful framing of like, what is the side you disagree with right about? And like just having that question, because it's so easy to assume that they're right about nothing. Like we have all the logic, we have all the facts, we have all the good values, et cetera, and the other side has none of it. And like, probably that's not true. I mean, maybe every once in a while it's true, but it's pretty rare.
Well, certainly in the debates we've done, almost all, I mean, first of all, we have to think that there are good arguments on both sides, so we're not going to do the debate. But secondly, the audience, which, as you say, is self-selected, but as being relatively open-minded, but still, to get 30% of people to change their minds. I mean, that's really saying something powerful about not only the format, but political culture. And at least there are some people out there who are really open-minded. And I think that that's great. And that's what you can build on.
It's interesting how on some topics it seems that people's beliefs are essentially unmovable. Like it's hard to imagine anything that would change their mind. And then on other topics, it seems like people are much more evidence focused, where they might have an opinion now, but actually, if they see the right evidence, they're going to switch their view. And I wonder if that ends up tying in more to things around identity. Like, on a certain belief, they might have an opinion, but it's not so wrapped up in their identity that they're sort of unwilling to budge.
Yeah, that's interesting. We never did a debate on abortion, for example, because I
Hmm.
just felt like it was an area that, well, it's very contentious. Nobody was going to change their minds on abortion. Um, we did do a debate on the effects of the repeal of Roe and Wade, because that's very factually oriented and how that might have played out. And in fact, it played out with where there was practically no change in the number of abortions in the country pre and post Roe and Wade decision.
Really?
Uh,
Why is
yeah,
that?
very well, because people substituted the pills for abortion procedures. The states with the biggest populations continued to have abortions available. People would travel if they needed to. So it really didn't have that much of an impact. But I mean, I'm just giving that as an example of something that could be a fact-based debate, whereas the feelings about abortion are ones where nobody's gonna change their minds. So
One
so
thing
we
I've Okay.
we wouldn't have debated abortion, but we might have debated the impact of that, for example.
One thing I find fascinating about the abortion debate is the right tends to frame it as like abortion is murder, and the left tends to frame it as abortion has no negative consequences. Nothing is lost through abortion, even up until like the day before a baby would be born. But actually, if you look at like the sort of most American people, they're kind of actually interestingly enough somewhere in the middle, where they think abortion, early abortion, the first 2 trimesters is totally fine, but then they actually become pretty wary of it as you get closer and closer to birth, where they start saying, oh, maybe it should not be allowed or only allowed in special cases. So it's interesting to me where it like actually there's a pretty common majority view that is sort of somewhere in the sort of murky middle there.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that that middle is so murky is itself interesting, because where do you draw the line and why? But yeah, I would say very, very few people would be in favor of, you know, what they call partial birth abortion. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, there are definitely people on the left who support that, but it's far from a majority view. And so, yeah, I mean, it's complex and it's nuanced, like most contentious issues.
You mentioned earlier that you don't like the framing of this idea of giving back. Why don't you like that idea?
I don't like the idea of philanthropy framed as, quote, giving back, because it implies that you got the means to be philanthropic by taking something away, by hollowing out, by doing a process. The implication is that you got the means to be philanthropic by taking something away from society. And my view is that if you built a successful business, the odds are very high that you contributed something to society. Maybe it's a better technological solution. Maybe it's creating a better environment for your employees to flourish and be creative. Maybe it's a better way of serving your customers. Maybe it's a better way of using limited resources. But building a successful business contributes to society. You don't owe anything back. To me, and I call one of the chapters in the book, uh, The Selfish Philanthropist. And the idea really is that if you don't owe anything back, why be philanthropic? Well, the answer to me is because it's an opportunity to exercise your talents, your abilities, your organizational skills, whatever, for the benefit of society and grow yourself in the process.
Why say selfish, right? Because I mean, unless you are unconcerned with the benefit you're causing to other people.
Well, it's selfish in the sense that it's a perfectly legitimate question to say, what is in this for me as a philanthropist? And to say, okay, well, engaging in this process and this activity is going to be very satisfying for me. So I'll do it. Something else, maybe just writing a check passively, not so not so satisfying.
So, do you think that people should have an obligation to do altruism in addition to sort of doing what's good for themselves?
I wouldn't say it's an obligation because I don't subscribe to this giving back that they owe something. On the other hand, I think the well-lived life, in my estimation, does include acting for the benefit of society, does include using philanthropy as a broader way of exercising your own abilities, having a broader canvas to paint on with whatever creativity, whatever abilities you can bring to bear.
As a billionaire, I imagine you're constantly inundated with people trying to get you to give to whatever cause uh, they favor. Does that become frustrating? Having everyone around you try to get money from you?
Not really, because I really operate by this principle of I really want my philanthropy to be in areas where I feel I can make a real contribution besides just writing a check. So open to debate is an example. Uh, just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times announced another philanthropic initiative of ours called Canyon, which is a new venue on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which will be a place for video art, for artists who are using the moving image, using the integration of art and music, art and technology, interactive technologies to create immersive experiences. And these are all artists who are basically in museum collections and recognized as important artists. But I felt they needed an environment where people would take the time to engage with those. These take duration. They take time to engage with. And I felt you needed a custom-made institution to get people to engage with those art forms in the way that the artist intended. So that's another example. And the third major one for me is research on longevity, or more precisely, extending human health spans by understanding why we age in the first instance, what is going on at a molecular level in our cells that make them over time become vulnerable to disease, that make them less fit for purpose. And those three are all things that I felt, that were personal initiatives that I could get involved with, that I could direct, that I could lead, that I could have a meaningful impact. And that's how I'm concentrating my own philanthropic dollars.
What do you think of I don't know if you've heard of the effective altruism movement before, but what do you think of the philosophy that comes from the effective altruism movement that says, well, yes, we're going to spend a bunch of our time and money doing things that are beneficial for ourselves, but when we're thinking altruistically, we should be thinking about what does the most good per unit dollar, where, good could be defined in different ways, but some people might define good as terms of reducing suffering. And so they want to say, how do you reduce suffering as much as possible per unit dollar? Or, you might define good in alternative ways to that, but that basically it's taking an optimizing mindset.
It's fine. I think if that works for you, great. I have uh, no argument against it as an individual choice. But I think there are other ways of looking at it. I mean, yes, you can take a quantitative view of maybe the greatest good for the greatest number, but that would not have produced the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It would not have produced philanthropy at high culture. It might not have produced Harvard University or Yale. Uh, there are philanthropies that are more directed toward high culture, high intellectual achievements, high scientific achievements. There are others that are directed more at people who are suffering, as you say. And society needs both. I think the effective altruism movement is looking at one worthy thing, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah, because I think probably there's different opinions in the effective altruism community, but I think some would say, well, something like a museum of art, well, that's really nice. Like if you actually convert it to like how many lives could be radically improved if you were to give that money to extremely poor people in Africa, for example, that it doesn't stack up. It ultimately doesn't produce enough value in the world relative to what it could be used for.
You're the philanthropist, you make that decision. But I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't want to impose the effective altruism view on this on anybody else.
Yeah, I think it tends to, some people it resonates with them immediately, and other people just, it doesn't resonate. I'm wondering if you feel like you have values that are bigger than yourself that you like, for example, the value of truth seeking. Like you could think of open debate as like promoting the value of truth seeking, which is something that's sort of like bigger than yourself. And do you feel that way with your philanthropy, that you're going after these values that are like external to you, that are deeply important to you? Or do you do you kind of frame it differently?
I mean, I'd say in my own philanthropies, I think the values are consistent with my own. I mean, that's sort of part of the point, in a sense, I mean, I think the greatest gift that science could confer on human flourishing is extending our health spans, the period
Hmm.
before we get the debilities of old age. I mean, that's absolutely consistent with my values, intellectual interests, benefit to society. I don't see any particular conflict there. I think in open to debate, um, again, it's totally consistent with my values of privileging rationality, privileging uh, critical thought over sort of emotional autopilot. So, I mean, I think philanthropy in my case, is quite consistent with my values, and I don't know why that's not a good universal principle.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. Is I think it's an alternative way. So effective altruists tend to think about it as like a maximization principle, right? Like get the most bang for the buck per dollar to minimize suffering or something like that. Another way to think about it is you've got a set of values that you care about deeply, and you're trying to like create more of them in the world, like right, execute on those values. Um, One principle in your book that comes up is this idea that the obstacle is the way. What does that mean?
Well, it's a basic Stoic idea that uh, our actions can be impeded by obstacles, and the Stoic is trying to look at those obstacles in a positive way. So, I mean, I give a few examples from my early childhood, which is I was in a extremely financially insecure situation where my parents were worried about paying electric bills and phone bills, and I was well aware of that. I mean, they were emotionally intense experiences when I was 6, 7 years old. So that obstacle, the way for me in response to that was taking full responsibility for my own life, realizing that I would have to figure out for myself how the world worked and how to make my way in it. An obstacle I faced early on was the burden of bad ideas. My mother was a communist and she was very vocal about Marxist ideology at home. And it, I mean, as a 10-year-old, I was hearing from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And I was thinking, God, I mean, I'm able, I get good grades. Should I take my grade points and give them to some stupid, lazy kid? Well, I mean, like, what sense does this make? So the obstacle is bad ideas, but the way is critical thinking. I had no role models at home or in the world that I was occupying, and or nothing that really seemed aspirational. The way for me became reading biographies. So and I read them as how to do it manuals. What is a successful life? What is a well-lived life based on the lives of hundreds of people in different walks of life that I would read about. But obviously, they only write biographies about pretty exceptional people, so that gave me a very interesting set of ideas about what my own aspirations might be. So those are some illustrations of the obstacle becoming the way.
Is it fair to describe that as the idea that when the world presents you with an obstacle, you can actually use it as sort of a growth experience? And so the obstacle then becomes sort of the thing that directs you to sort of the next level
Perfectly
of growth?
put. Yes, exactly.
On the topic of communism, I'm curious, like, have you had a debate and opened a debate about sort of communism versus capitalism?
Yes, done debates on capitalism, and I mean it was not exactly communism versus capitalism, but um, I think one of the resolutions was two cheers for capitalism.
Hmm.
So not three cheers, but that capitalism works okay.
Do you think that communism is completely devoid of value as a philosophy, or do you think it might get some elements right, but then it kind of puts them together in a way that you think leads to bad conclusions?
I mean, it's been tried and it hasn't worked. Uh, we've seen that generally economic freedom is associated with progress in human welfare. I think, China is the greatest example in my lifetime, and we still call it a communist country. But basically, they've really, I mean, I argue in the book, there's a chapter called Give China Face. And it says one of the arguments is that China is one of the least communist countries if you measure communism by the share of GNP that the central government controls. In China, that share is about 16%. In the US, it's 26. In Britain, it's about 45. In France, it's 54.
Oh, interesting.
So, my definition of communism might not be well aligned with the reflexive view about what's a communist country, but I definitely feel that it's almost proven that economic freedom and freedom of individuals to innovate, to build businesses, to act with economic freedom produces better outcomes than when things are centrally controlled by the government.
It's interesting to hear you say that because when I went to China for a little while, just a couple of weeks, and I was shocked at how capitalist it felt to me. I
Yeah,
really
exactly.
expected it to not feel capitalist, but I was like, in a way, certain ways, it feels more capitalist than New York, just the vibe of it. And
Oh,
yeah,
sure. I mean,
yeah.
you could drive around in taxis in China. I don't know if this is true now, but like 8 or 10 years ago, it was taxi drivers would have photographs of Jack Ma as a kind of hero figure uh, in their cabs. And I, I can't think of any taxi driver in New York that has a business leader as a hero.
On this particular quote you mentioned, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, it seems to me that that model might be a useful model in some circumstances. Like imagine a family, right? It's like, well, the person who can provide is going to provide, and the person who has needs is going to get taken care of, right? And it's sort of like, it's to me, it seems like it actually becomes less and less tenable, sort of the bigger the group and the less incentive aligned the group is.
And that makes sense. But, I mean, even at a family level, it can get very tricky. I mean, I know families that, for example, might have an autistic child, and that's the neediest child. But how much of a sacrifice do the more able children have to suffer because of the attention given to the child with the greatest needs? So even on a family level, it's not a no-brainer.
That's an interesting point. It also reminds me of sort of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance idea, where he said like you should try to maximize the worst off, and that's sort of like the approach to making a good society, which many people disagree with, but it kind of it rhymes with that same idea.
Yeah, well, the book talks about Rawls a bit, but it also talks about Nozick. Rawls is talking about distributive justice. Does he like the way goods and services are distributed in society, and what does he think is the optimal way of doing that? Whereas Nozick talks about the process. It's the question is not whether the outcome is fair, but whether the process is fair. And if the process is a result of free exchange by free people, with no coercion, with no force, with no misinformation, you just accept the results. We did a debate that really kind of raised this issue very nicely. The resolution was Taylor Swift deserves her billions. And the philosophical idea there was that, whatever distribution, Rawlsian distribution of stuff you made, if people chose to give a couple of $1 billion for the pleasure of hearing her perform, hearing Taylor Swift perform, what's wrong with that? I mean, she's better off. They're better off. They made free choices. Just because you wouldn't have given that particular person a couple of $1 billion in whatever Rawlsian framework you had, it's almost asking the wrong question. The Nozick question would be, was there anything wrong with the process by which she got her billions? And the answer, at least in the debate, would have been no.
This seems to get at a core divide between the left and the right about how they view sort of the effects of making money. And I think people on the left are more prone to say, well, there are a lot of companies that make money in ways that are not beneficial to society. Some are even harmful to society. And sometimes it's, indirect harms like, pollution or increasing global warming. Sometimes it's direct harms like, ripping off customers and yet, some of the companies, well, sometimes that's illegal and the companies get taken down. Other companies are able to sort of skirt around, like they're able to kind of, play the game where it's not technically illegal, but they do end up harming customers. And then towards the right, I think people tend to view it as like, look, if people are willing to give you their money, then you're probably benefiting them. Why would they give you their money otherwise? As long as it's truly a free exchange, as long as you're not lying, like, each transaction probably creates good in the world. It sounds to me like you kind of tend to fall more on the right side of that divide. But yeah, what do you think of the sort of left perspective on that?
I think you've framed it well, and frankly, the reason we picked Taylor Swift as the subject of that debate was precisely because there's almost nothing you could say against the way she made her billions. Uh, Nobody understands how hedge fund guys or private equity guys make their billions, so you can't really hold them as a model.
Right,
And
because
as you
people don't know how to evaluate their behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, no, nobody knows how they did it or why they did it or what benefit it gave them. So they're not good. That wouldn't have made a good debate.
Right.
Uh, and as you say, people on the left approach corporate. I mean, there's a kind of anti-capitalist framing almost where they will look for evidence that supports the idea that building a successful business has to be quasi-corrupt or taking advantage or exploitative in some fashion or whatever. And if you come at the world with a frame, and this is again a Stoic principle, if you come at the world with a frame, you will find evidence to support that frame. And you'll interpret ambivalent evidence, again, to support your framing, and evidence that goes the other way, you just disregard. So framing is a cognitive mistake. Uh, and I think it's a mistake that the Stoics caution against. The idea is distinguish between facts and interpretation. Try to look at the facts as coolly and as rationally as possible, and don't approach the world with a framed view and then try to um, only consider the facts that support that view.
It's so tricky because most people see themselves as looking at things in an objective way, right? Like I 100% agree with you, but I also think a lot of people would be like, "Oh, that is what I'm doing," right? Even if they're not.
Yeah, I think Stoicism teaches you a certain humility and makes you more conscious of that framing, which I would regard as a kind of a cognitive distortion. So if you're privileging rationality, you really want to avoid a sort of a preconceived framing of anything and be open to the evidence that points in all different directions.
As I started studying rationality and cognitive biases more when I was younger, I started thinking that I'm less and less rational. And I would suggest that that's actually the ideal thing to happen because chances are you are more irrational than you realize. And so as you start to study it, like hopefully you'll start noticing the ways that you've been irrational and hadn't identified it before. At least that's my thinking.
The last sentence in the chapter in the book dealing with open to debate is one of the precepts I took away from this whole experience is beware of ideology, especially your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the hardest by far. You know, it reminds me of what Feynman said. It's like the first thing is not to fool yourself, but you're the easiest person to fool. Um, yeah. On the question of the kind of the left-right divide around companies, I'm curious to hear your reaction to how I think about it, which is that I think whether companies cause good or harm actually hinges to a significant extent on the quality of regulation and the enforcement of regulation. That in an environment where their laws are not effectively made, like let's suppose it's totally legal to dump your sewage in the river and poison all the people of the village, like some schmuck is going to come along and do that because they can make it more profitable to do that. And like, but good regulation will say, no, you can't dump your waste in the river. And if you do it, you're going to go to jail. And then of course that has to be enforced. And so that I kind of think of it as there's ways that companies can make money helping the world. There's ways that companies can make money that are kind of neutral for the world. And there are ways that companies can make money that harm the world. And good regulation tries to eliminate all the ways they can make money harming the world. And then once you do that successfully, then companies become a force for good. Curious to hear your reaction.
Well, I think the example you gave is completely unexceptional because if a company imposes costs on society by polluting rivers or stuff like that and doesn't have to pay for that cost, I mean, that's simply a distortion. That's not the way markets are supposed to work. And that kind of regulation seems absolutely clear. If a company causes harm as part of its process, either they should be regulated so that they can't do that, or if they do it, they've got to pay the people who are harmed. And we do have a tort system that
Well,
does that to some degree.
just on that point really quick, because I think this is often a misunderstanding people have where they think that sort of economics says that you should have a completely free market, but actually economics says that exactly cases like this, you actually need regulation, you need taxing to go in to solve the distortion. And which I think is what you're getting at.
In that situation, regulation is probably a good thing. But you could argue that it could work in an unregulated way if the companies were sued, if the people, let's say, whose water was polluted, would then sue that company and in fact force them to pay the costs of the pollution or avoid polluting in the first place because it's much less costly to do that than to pay for all those damages. So I mean, there are different ways that you might get to that result, but the result you want is that a company has to pay for all of its inputs, and or pay for all of the costs, let's say, of its operation. A trickier example to me would be social media companies. I really grapple with that one. I would have felt initially that a company like Facebook was a great thing for society. It was making it much easier to form communities of common interest. It was helping people maintain social networks. It seemed like a very good thing at the beginning. I now feel like these companies are potentially really damaging our civil society by setting up these filter bubbles in which they're basically operating like capitalists. They're operating in a valid way to give you what you want and give me what I want. So it seems like a good thing to give you the news that's of interest to you and give me the news that's of interest to me. But the second order effect, the unintended consequences, are that you're getting news that reinforces your pre-existing views, and I'm getting news that reinforces mine, and we get a very polarized society as a result. And that to me is, there you're getting into, I think, a very, very subtle and tricky area. Um, and it's not obvious what kind of regulation you would want, or who would be the regulators, or who would have the expertise in government to regulate some of these very complicated areas. So, I mean, these are tricky questions.
Yeah, that's a good example. Another example I think about are multi-level marketing companies. I don't know how much familiar you are with them, but and I don't want to say that they're all the same as each other, but quite a number of multi-level marketing companies, they basically convince people to become agents for them who then kind of sell their products on their behalf. But most of the compensation comes not from selling the product, but by convincing other people to also become agents for them. So it ends up this thing where like you make the most money by convincing people to join, to convince people to join, to convince people to join, and they start looking very Ponzi scheme-esque. And I think there's an argument to be made that like, although people are freely choosing to join these, right? Nobody's coercing them, that many of the people involved end up harmed. Like in many cases, well over 90% of the people who join end up losing money. And so then it's like, it's a tricky case because it's like people are acting freely and yet they often end up worse off than they started. So how do you think about a case like that?
I think a case like that is simply an information thing that companies should be required. I mean, to regulate and say, okay, you need to disclose the fact that 90% of the people who are selling this product wind up losing money doing it. And that has to be a disclosure item. Similarly with, like, you have disclosure around securities or disclosure around side effects of drugs or what have you. That seems like a sort of a basic disclosure thing. I mean, people are making free decisions, but they're not making well-informed decisions. And if there's an information asymmetry here, to correct that seems both capitalist and desirable.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But a fascinating thing is that many of these companies actually do release disclosures of how much people make, income disclosures. And the income disclosures are absolutely horrendous. Like they make the company look terrible. And yet the companies are so good at persuading, or I guess their agents are really so good at persuading people, they continue to exist. So it's like, I mean, and it goes back to critical thinking on some level, right?
Well, it reminds me of Albert Einstein had a quote that I loved. He said, "Human intelligence is limited. Human stupidity is not."
It's a tough one, right? Maybe where you and I disagree, if we disagree on this, is that just like what percentage of companies find a way to make money doing harm versus doing good? And like, I think a lot of companies make money doing good or doing neutral stuff that's at least not harmful. But I do think maybe like a non-negligible fraction are making money doing harm. And that's something we should try to regulate out of existence and insofar as possible.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there are. I mean, I gave the Facebook example as one that I would regard as pretty tricky, pretty ambivalent as to whether a company like that is on balance doing good or harm. And I'm interested in really big companies that are going to have significant social impacts. I mean, the kinds
Mm-hmm.
of like these Ponzi scheme kind of things. I mean, they're not. I mean, they might be interesting examples to talk about, but they're not a big part of the economy. People are not becoming mega rich building companies like that. People are getting banker rich because they are doing major innovations like Google, like Amazon, like Facebook. I mean, those are the or in the coming generation AI. I mean, these are the really big impact things that I personally would like to focus on more.
I'm curious if you've kind of thought about the consequences of AI, and are you concerned about consequences of AI? Are you more bullish on it?
Well, I have to say I'm a resolute techno optimist. So I think AI is very likely to propel a huge increase in productivity. Um, I sense it myself. I mean, I'm just a lot more personally productive since I've started to learn to use the various AI platforms. It's almost like I have a handful of PhD level assistants researching and doing great quick work on almost anything that I'm interested in or anything I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm very optimistic that AI and AI plus robotics are going to really spark a huge increase in productivity. But people tend to, and I've done enough debates on the almost every technological innovation, people's sort of go-to reaction is techno-pessimism. And there's so much more public conversation about the risks than there is about the potential. And the risks are there, they're real, but personally, I'm much more excited about the potential than I am concerned about the risks. And I think the prevailing view is the other way around.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's many different risks that people worry about, sort of different sorts. Things like job loss on the one hand, or things like deep fakes, or bots being used to spread misinformation at like a kind of a new scale, or automated hacking. You sort of there's so many of these different things, and you have these different constituent groups that worry about different aspects of it, right? Some people worry about losing their job. Some people worry about AI being uncontrollable and destroying civilization.
That's true. People tend to be, I think it's sort of wired into human nature to be more concerned about the risks and less concerned about or less persuaded by the upside. And one of the points I make in the book is that it's a Stoic idea that change is inevitable, nothing is permanent, and the people who create change are going to be on the right side of things. The people who adapt to change are going to do fine, but the people who resist change are not. That's not going to be helpful. It's not going to produce a good outcome.
Nick Bostrom has this interesting thought experiment. He's a philosopher where he imagines technology as though you're drawing balls from an urn. And some of the technology, you draw it's like society invents a new technology. We don't know what it's going to be like. Some of the balls drawn from the urn are white balls that, he describes them as like, oh, they're beneficial technologies. They improve healthcare, et cetera, right? Some are gray balls where they're sort of mixed effects. Like maybe social media is like this, where there's some good things, some bad things. It's complicated. But then he has this idea of some technologies might be black balls, where once you draw them from the urn, once you invent them, like it sends society on a dangerous path or harms society, but you can't put them back in because now that the technology is unleashed, like it's very, very hard to get rid of it. And sort of his question is like, well, what percentage of technologies are black balls, and like how many can society afford to draw? Maybe we draw one black ball and like society's over. And if we kind of think of it this way, then it makes it sort of harder to be a techno-optimist because it might be like we're sort of doing these experiments on society that nobody's planning. We're just kind of doing it because someone invented the technology.
Well, I think that's a terrible idea. I mean, it basically is an argument for freezing knowledge where it is now. It completely goes against human progress, and it just strikes me as an awful idea.
Like if you think about sort of risks to society, like let's say there's a new technology that has a 1% chance of creating some devastating effect, like mass nuclear war. Like, do you think how do you think we should best handle cases like that?
Well, I think again, I think you need rational decision making. I think people do have a tendency to catastrophize, to think about absolutely the worst case outcome and focus on that thing. And that's simply not a rational way of deciding. Rational is you're looking at costs, you're looking at benefits, you're weighing them against each other. You're not obsessing about a single unlikely case, a very unlikely case. And
Mm.
I just think it's a cognitive distortion to be constantly catastrophizing and thinking about, well, how do I mitigate the risk of the most unlikely case, as opposed to how do I maximize the value of the expected value of this innovation, of this activity.
I feel like it's complicated because if it's true catastrophizing where you're kind of putting much more weight on something than it really deserves, I completely agree. But if you do an expected value calculation, if you've got one really really big negative, even if it has a small probability, it can like change the whole expected value calculation, right?
Well, there's the story I start out with in the book is a story where I risk the entirety of my liquid assets in a very leveraged way, in a transaction where if we lost 20% of our money, I would be wiped out. And I explained why I made that calculation, why it was something that very few people would do, uh, but why it was the rational calculation. And I addressed this catastrophizing idea because in this example, if I had thought that the worst case was that I'd end up homeless and living under a bridge, I wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm.
But by thinking, well, okay, if I lost 100% of my liquid assets, what situation would I be in? Well, I would have learned something from the experience. I'd be able to recreate the kind of job I left to start the business. Uh, my family's not going to go hungry. It's not going to be horrible. And by thinking realistically about the undesired outcome, it helps you um, get over your innate emotional response. I mean, the emotion in that case is fear. I mean, what's going to happen if this doesn't work? And that fear emotion is very natural. But I didn't act on fear. I acted on what I thought was a rational calculation of risks and rewards, and it stood me in very good stead. And that's the sort of opening story of the book.
In retrospect, what do you think the percent chance was that it would have gone bust?
I thought 1 in 3.
Hmm.
Um, I thought there was one chance in 3 that I'd make 100x my money, and
Well,
one
it's a
chance
very
in
good
3.
expected value, though very scary.
Yeah, no, that's the arrangement I made just to flesh it out the story is um, the normal deal at that time was for people doing what I was trying to do, which was early days of leveraged buyouts. The guy doing the work would get 20% and wouldn't put up any money. So it was sort of heads he wins, the investor loses. My investors were didn't like that structure. They felt that it didn't align interests well, that I would be, inclined to take excessive risk. And I said, you're right. It doesn't align interests well. And you want me to take more risk? I'm willing to do it. I'll put up 100% of my liquid assets on this basis. I want 50% of the profits, and I'll absorb 50% of the losses. And they viewed that as a very courageous decision, but a decision that would completely get me focused on minimizing risk. And it worked out extremely well for them. It worked out extremely well for me.
What multiple did you make on the investment?
Oh dear. uh, the first deal we did, we lost $100,000. Think about this. This was a long time ago, so these numbers you sort of multiply by 10. Uh,
Okay.
so I was risking $400,000, which was my liquid net worth at the time. I think it's maybe 4 million in today's purchasing power. First deal we did, we lost $100,000. Second deal, we made $100 million. So it sort of averaged out.
Wow, that's wild. Um, Before we wrap up, I thought it might be fun to do a rapid fire round where I ask you a bunch of difficult questions and just get your quick take. How do you feel about that?
Sure, whatever.
All right, cool. So, relevant to what we were just discussing, imagine your life was re-rolled over and over again. Obviously you've been tremendously successful. Like what percentage of the time do you think you end up at the level of success you have now versus other levels? If the dice were re-rolled over and over.
Well, luck definitely played a part. I mean, you don't know quite the road less taken. You don't know what might have happened if you were unlucky. But Samuel Butler has a quote that I always like: "As a man succeeds in life, he develops a deeper appreciation of his own abilities. As he fails, he develops a deeper appreciation of the role of luck in human affairs."
It's probably something to that. What would you like to see debated more in society?
Everything.
That's a good answer. Is there any particular topic that stands out as like nobody, people aren't talking about X, but we should be?
I'm a free speech absolutist. I really feel like there should be no subjects that are off the table.
Yeah, funny anecdote, we ran a study on intelligence recently, and one of the funny correlates of IQ is that higher IQ people were more willing to have people they hate be able to speak out and protest and debate, which I thought was fascinating. So if you hate the neo-Nazis, like higher IQ people are more willing to allow the neo-Nazis to speak and give debates and stuff. So
yeah, I would feel that way.
Yeah. If someone wants to watch one of the open debates, what do you think what's a great debate to start on?
Well, probably the most contentious one and the one that had the biggest audience was this of the things we've done in the last year or so, the Gaza debate. Israel's actions in Gaza were justified. And probably the most nuanced and almost least debatey was the one that we just released on Harvard Had It Coming. Those would be two great ones to start.
What do you think is a critical thinking skill that most people don't learn?
I think most people don't learn critical thinking, period.
Interesting.
Probably the best discipline is this idea of really trying to very consciously separate facts from interpretation. And I think that's the sort of starting point, is to simply look at the facts with no interpretation whatsoever, and then layer in interpretations, but realize that those interpretations are flawed. Have some humility about your interpretations, but start with simply the facts.
Yeah, it's so interesting how we all have stories we tell, but we don't treat them as stories. We don't see them as stories. We just see them as that's just the way reality is, right?
Yep.
What's your perspective on how to use your time, right? You could be doing so many things with your time. How do you prioritize?
Well, that's an absolutely key Stoic idea, that Stoics view time as your most limited resource. Far more important to discipline yourself about time than anything else. And what Marcus Aurelius says is, for peace of mind, do less, but do it with greater concentration. And eliminate the things that are non-essential. Just don't clutter up your calendar, don't clutter up your mind, don't use your time on things that don't really matter. And think very consciously, what really matters to me? What relationships matter? What projects matter? What skills matter? What objectives matter? And use your time purposefully. It's a very key Stoic principle. It's something that I've tried to follow in my life, and critical idea.
Yeah, I could definitely benefit from doing more of that. All right, last two questions. People who are incredibly successful, I think, often have a challenge that they can live in their own filter bubble where people don't want to disagree with them. People want it because people want their favor. Do you have a challenge getting people to be honest with you, or do you find that it's actually not so hard to get people to tell you the brutal honesty?
Well, I think you need to I think if you write a book, people are probably going to tell you nice things about it rather than critical things about it, which is sort of the experience I'm having right now. But on a more serious level, if I'm, let's say, having a meeting, I make a very conscious effort to be sure that the most junior people at the meeting are free to speak up and free to throw their ideas out. And I'll even have almost a rule in certain kinds of meetings that no idea can be criticized. Be time enough to evaluate them later. But the purpose of this meeting is to simply get ideas on the table. So I'm very conscious of the fact that people are not necessarily comfortable speaking out in the presence of people they regard as figures of authority and try to consciously encourage them to do that.
Final question. Where do you think people should get their news from? Right? I think this is a big struggle that people end up getting news from, just one perspective or from social media, et cetera.
Well, I think you should consciously look for a variety of news sources. I mean, I read the New York Times, I read the Wall Street Journal, I read the Financial Times. I think The Economist is pretty good. Uh, and I think there is a real issue when getting your news from social media because it will be filtered in ways that are not helpful.
Robert, thanks so much for coming on.
Spencer, it's been a good conversation. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me.